Well, good evening and welcome. So that music was setting the scene, I hope. May not be everybody's cup of tea. It's from Stephen Foster's songbook. Stephen Foster is often considered to be the founder of proper American music. And he lived rather a short life from 1826 to 1864. But that's the kind of music which Edith Wharton may occasionally have listened to. And of course, it's Edith Wharton's The Age of Innocence that we're going to be considering this evening. So in my last lecture, which was the third of 4 on the novel, and what I call its extraordinary bagginess, in other words, the novel as a genre is a genre that allows you to stuff all sorts of different kinds of subject matter into it. And in that sense, I think it can be distinguished from the other 2 genres that I'll be going on to talk about, poetry and theatre. So in my third lecture of 4, we explored the degree to which the genre of the novel allows for explorations of idealistic or utopian ideas about how we might better organise ourselves as social beings. Idealist and utopian novels, I argue, imagine other ways in which we might organise ourselves as social beings, and in imagining them, perhaps make possible radical change. Pierre Leroux, who was a friend of Georges Sand's and was a utopian socialist, defined idealism in terms of this notion that the ideas we have today may actually affect the future, may affect the way things are tomorrow, that ideas have a transformative power. And we looked at Georges Sand's novel François Le Champy, The Country Waif of 1848, which is in part about an incestuous relationship, which is presented in some ways as an ideal. Before that, we considered the capacity of the novel to allow us to explore political history. This was based on the writings of another 19th century French novelist, Henri Belle, who wrote under the pseudonym of Stendhal. And the focus was on his novel Le Rouge et le Noir, The Red and the Black of 1830. And in the first of the 4 lectures that I gave on the novel, I discussed Samuel Johnson's Rasselas of 1759. Johnson's working title had been The Choice of Life. And I analysed the novel in terms of its capacity to explore what I called the morality of happiness. Is it actually incumbent on us to try to find lives which make us happy? Tonight, in my final lecture on the novel, before we move on to poetry and theatre, I'd like to consider the genre of the novel as a vehicle for the exploration of human psychology. And as a very loose definition of psychology, I'd like to propose this, the means of exploring ideas, feelings, and behaviours. Now, most novels are about an individual or individuals in a social setting. I think I'd challenge anyone to come up with a novel that isn't true to that definition, about an individual or individuals in a social setting. And this is certainly true of Edith Wharton's The Age of Innocence of 1920. And in exploring how individuals function in a group, psychology will almost necessarily form a part of things. It's been argued, however, that Wharton's novels are better described as social satires, as commentaries on society. And it's her short stories, many critics have argued, that really provide the great psychological insights. So, for example, Carol Singley, in a double review of a Wharton biography, the one by Shari Benstock, and a book about Wharton and the First World War, Carol Singley writes, "Her fiction is Janus-faced. Her social satires fill the large canvas of the novels, whereas her explorations of the inner life, of psychology and parapsychology, fill, and I quote, the smaller canvases of short stories." Throughout her career, Wharton shifted between these 2 forms of writing, chronicling the social scene while simultaneously penetrating its members' inner lives. And that's the end of the quotation. So what she's proposing is that there's a clear distinction between the genre of the short story and the genre of the novel, that these are distinct forms, and one, the short story, in Wharton's hands, becomes enormously insightful in terms of human psychology, whereas the novel, being this bigger, broader canvas, allows Wharton to explore social life. Well, in one of my introductory lectures last year, when I was talking about reading more generally, I sounded some words of caution about books which purport to teach you how to write novels, both books and indeed courses. There are an awful lot of them now. And one of the things I wanted to argue is that most of those books and courses tend to dissect the novel into constituent parts and treat those parts discretely. So, for example, you'll have a chapter on character, a chapter on description, a chapter on narrative technique, a chapter perhaps on tone, and so on. And I'm not at all sure that it's useful to dissect the parts of the novel in that way. And similarly, Singley, in the review that I just quoted, distinguishes between the social scene and members' inner lives. And I think that this is equally mistaken. Now, at the risk of mixing my metaphors, I've already proposed the novel as a capacious sack into which you can stuff all sorts of things. I now want to propose another metaphor and suggest that the novel's actually a Gordian knot. Now, the Gordian knot is the proverbial intricate knot, which is impossible to untie because one end is hidden. And of course, we use it as a metaphor for an intractable problem. But in mythology, there was indeed, and we're going back to about 330 BC, an actual Gordian knot. And this evening, one of the things that I'd like to argue is that in a novel like The Age of Innocence, I'll refer to a couple of other Wharton novels this evening, Wharton provides both acute social satire and very modern insights into the human psychology of the members of that society. And these two are inextricably part and parcel of each other. And this is because the categories of person and place are beautifully fused in Wharton's fiction. Before I begin that argument, which is a relatively complex one, and I'll attempt to illustrate it, I think it's useful to give a brief account of Wharton's life, because it does to some degree feed into my arguments, and to provide a number of descriptions of the novel for those of you who may not yet have had a chance to read it. Well, Edith Wharton, and she was a fine-looking woman, was born in New York on January the 24th in 1862. And here she is at the age of 5. So she died in Saint-Brice-sous-Forêt, near Paris, in 1937. And she was 75. I don't know whether any of you share my obsession, but whenever I see someone's birth date and death date, I always want to work out what age they were when they died. I don't quite know why, but... So she was 75. Her family was essentially sort of new aristocratic. It was distinguished, was well connected, it was long established, it was wealthy, and it was New York. She was educated by private tutors and governesses, both in New York and in Europe, where the family moved just after the American Civil War, 1861 to 65. And I have wondered whether there's a strange paradox that on the one hand you can argue that women for a long time didn't have the same kind of education opportunities that men had, and indeed Edith herself didn't in a sense. She wasn't able to go to university, she had these private tutors and governesses. But I think it did mean, and I don't think Edith was alone in this, I think many women of that kind of privileged class did actually gain a very particular and independent kind of education as a function of this. A more original education than her male counterparts who were all going through a system, as it were. So I think it gave her a kind of independence of mind. She was a voracious reader, and she made her debut in society in 1879, age 17, there I go again. And she married Edward Wharton, who was a wealthy Boston banker, in 1885. He was 12 years older than she was, from a Boston family, a sportsman, and from a similarly confident social class. They both enjoyed travel, But a few years into the marriage, Edward started to suffer from serious depression, and by 1902, it had developed into a really chronic mental disorder and was deemed incurable. And that same year, Wharton fell in love with the promiscuous Morton Fullerton. He was a correspondent for the London Times. And in Morton, she found an intellectual companion who shared her interest in writing, unlike her relationship with her husband, where they didn't have those kinds of common interests. The affair with Morton only lasted about 3 years. Now, although Edith had a book of poems printed privately when she was 16, I think this was really her mother's attempt to get writing out of her system. It wasn't until later that she began to take writing really seriously and to develop a disciplined way of going about things, as almost all novelists eventually do. She was influenced above all by her friend and fellow writer Henry James, who had indeed introduced her to Fullerton, and their work shows shared concern both for artistic form and for the exploration of ethical dilemmas. She contributed a few poems and stories to Harper's, Scribner's, these were major magazines in America in the 1890s. And her next books were collections of short stories, The Greater Inclination of 1899 and Crucial Instances of 1901. And then in 1902, Wharton published her first novel, The Valley of Decision, and 3 years later, The House of Mirth. And the latter, The House of Mirth, bears some resemblance to The Age of Innocence. It's a detailed analysis of a hierarchical and oppressive society, the one in which she herself grew up. And The House of Mirth won her very wide critical acclaim and an audience keen to read more of her. This is the point at which her career really took off. And in the next 2 decades, she wrote novels including The Reef, 1912, The Custom of the Country, 1913, Summer, 1917, The Age of Innocence, 1920. And it was The Age of Innocence, 1920, which won a Pulitzer Prize, the Pulitzer Prize being an American prize for fiction, and she was the first woman ever to win a Pulitzer. So why in 1919, and that's the year in which Edith started to write The Age of Innocence, why was she intent on looking back 50 or so years ago to her childhood? Because the novel's set in the 1870s, hence the music that we heard at the beginning. So why did she at this juncture want to look back to her childhood in New York and a period which had been so very different from the New York in the early 20th century? Well, she spoke of the venture as a retreat, and I quote, to childish memories of a long-vanished America, unquote, and indeed a desire, quote, for momentary escape. But this, looking back, is barely indicative of a nostalgic desire, nor of an intention to write an historical novel. Although, like Stendhal's The Red and the Black, the novel does give us a keen sense of what it would have been like to live in New York in the 1870s, at least in the upper echelon. Edith's working title had been Old New York, but she was actually living in Paris at the time, and she'd been permanently resident in Paris from 1909. She organised institutions helping to feed, clothe and shelter the refugees who were pouring into the capital. She was actually awarded the Légion d'honneur, which is the highest civic award that the French state can award any non-French person. And then in 1919, when she started to write The Age of Innocence and look back to this period in New York in the 1870s, the Allied forces were busy remaking the map of Europe in the wake of the First World War. And what she was observing at first hand in Paris was individuals' relationships with place. And what The Age of Innocence does is to explore just this. She's looking back to old New York, not with naive nostalgia, but because it provides the richest and most familiar context in which she can start to consider what the interactions are between self and place. What difference does it make where we are? Does who we are and where we are? What is this relationship? And that was what fascinated her. And as I said earlier, she writes about these two things as an inseparable pair. You cannot surgically separate character and setting. So, what's the novel about? Well, it presents a picture of upper-class New York society in the 1870s by way of an intractable triangular relationship between Newland Archer, who is the protagonist, and I'll explain that this obviously isn't the real Newland Archer. Then May Welland, who is his fiancée, beautiful fellow member of the Grand Society of New York, and Ellen Olenska, who is May's cousin. Now, these, of course, are images from The Age of Innocence, the film made in 1993. It was an American film adaptation. And it was made by Columbia Pictures, and Daniel Day-Lewis stars as Archer, Michelle Pfeiffer as May, and Winona Ryder as Ellen. Now, Ellen is a former member of their own social circle, who's returned to New York after a disastrous marriage to a Polish nobleman, Count Olenska. And Newland falls deeply in love with Ellen, but neither he nor Ellen is capable of breaking out of the conventions and taboos of their society and its times. Newland feels compelled to renounce Ellen and marry May. So it's at once a love story and a brilliant examination of the snobbery and hypocrisy of a wealthy elite. But I think it's worth providing some additional accounts of the novel from contemporary reviews, as these give us an insight into how the novel was actually read at the time. One of the things that we explored last year was this idea that a novel isn't a sort of fixed given, that a novel is actually something that a reader engages with. And in that sense, it isn't fixed. And I think proof of that is that when we reread a novel that we read in our youth, we think, good heavens, this isn't the same novel. We think that the novel's changed when, of course, we have. So I think it's always important to recognise that a novel isn't this sort of fixed set thing. And I think these contemporary reviews give us an insight into that. So how did Wharton's contemporaries engage with her novel? Well, here's one which I think is actually a misreading, at least in terms of its conclusion. Here, so the reviewer says, a young man, Newland Archer, belonging to the inner stock, the real thing, finds himself in conflict with the traditions that have made him. In conflict, that's to say, with a very large part of himself. His traditions, working with the smoothness of long practice, draw him remorselessly into the discreet, distinguished, airless world of his kind, into a sound profession and an unsuitable marriage, while the strain of rebellion pulls on the other side towards freedom, pulls violently, but at last has to own itself beaten. It's easier for a stranger to get into the guarded enclosure than for a native to get out of it. For Archer, freedom means Ellen Olenska, a member of the family party like himself, but one who has vividly and also disastrously succeeded in detaching herself and who's returned to it for support and consolation after her wandering. And the critic goes on to write, and this is where I think a misreading takes place. He says, Ellen is exquisite, and she and Archer are both of them much too intelligent to underrate the virtue and dignity of the forces opposed to them. The old order, in its way, is perfectly just and reasonable. Its standards are honourable. Two intelligent beings can only, in the end, respect them. And that's from the Norton edition, which are the great American editions of American fiction, which has an interesting section of reviews at the end. Now, what I want to argue, as I mentioned earlier, is that for Wharton, individuals and their contexts are not separable. It's not, in my view, that Archer and Ellen are too intelligent to free themselves from the old order. It's that the old order is part of them, and they are part of the old order. There is, in effect, no choice. And this is the acute insight into the psychologies of the characters, psychologies entirely shaped here by their social context. This is what makes the novel tragic, as there's that overwhelming sense of waste, which in my view characterises tragedy, a sense of waste, and in this case, wasted love. Other readers certainly found her recreation of people in place very convincing. One wrote, and I quote, "New York society and customs in the 70s are described with an accuracy that is almost uncanny. To read these pages is to live again." Another reviewer wrote, "It is said that this generation devours everything but remembers nothing," and then goes on to propose The Age of Innocence as a classic. And he writes, "As a picture of the upper class in our metropolis, as it stolidly solidified itself in the decade or so after the Civil War, the novel is curiously captivating. No one but Mrs. Wharton could have rendered the description so delicately exact. There is irony behind it all, but not the bitterness of scorn or contempt. It is an etching, not a caricature." And that's the end of the quotation. Now, this is a comment about Wharton's tone, and I agree. It's the sympathy which Wharton allows us to develop with her characters which makes the novel more than a social satire. It's not just about a society, it's about particular individuals who are bound up in that society, one which the previously quoted reviewer brilliantly describes as stolidly solidified. That captures the sense of entrapment. Archer has no choice but to give up his love of Ellen and marry May. All three are inseparably bound up with place. So it's this idea of the Gordian knot of the novel that I'd now like to develop. Let's begin with character. In The Age of Innocence, Wharton, in my view, brilliantly reinvents fictional character. She moves away from the notion of character in the novels of earlier compatriots, and I'm thinking particularly of Nathaniel Hawthorne. For Wharton, characters are not separable one from another. Identity is a function of multiple relationships, and not simply relationships with other characters. She expresses this herself in her fascinating work, The Writing of Fiction of 1925, which is an essay on fiction writing. And for anyone interested in fiction writing, I couldn't recommend it more. The Writing of Fiction, 1925. And in that, she writes, "The bounds of personality were not reproducible by a sharp black line, but that each of us flows imperceptibly into adjacent people and things." So rather than being an independent, contained entity, character for Wharton spills out into adjacent people and things. And I think this is very well expressed by Pamela Knight in her essay Forms of Disembodiment. She writes, "Readers soon discover that any observation about an individual character, about his or her consciousness, emotions, body, history, or language, also entangles us in the collective experience of the group, expressed in the welter of trifles, the matrix of social knowledge, within and out of which Wharton's subjects are composed." That's the end of the quotation. One could, of course, put it more succinctly, as Edith Wharton does herself, when in the same essay, The Writing of Fiction, she simply says, "Character and scenic detail are one." Well, I'd like to argue that this notion of character as entanglement in the people and things that surround the character is also achieved as a function of binding in two other constituent elements of novels, narrative technique and figurative language, that's to say imagery and symbolism and so on. Those two would often be considered constituent parts that are separable in the novel, narrative technique and figurative language. And I want to argue that, again, in Wharton, just as character and setting are fused together, so too narrative technique and figurative language are all fused together. So the point of view in The Age of Innocence is actually largely Newland Archer's. We see the world as from his point of view. But it's not a first-person narrative. It's not an I story from Archer's point of view. It's a third-person narrative, so Archer is described by a narrator, and yet the way the narrator presents the world is clearly the way that Archer is understanding it to be. And the critic William Kane, I think, describes this very well when he says, "We see characters and situations from his perspective and perceive Newland's and others' thoughts and feelings as he experiences them." At the outset of the novel, Newland is proud of his commitment to convention and takes pleasure in his place in 1870s New York society. However, as the novel proceeds, he grows disenchanted, embittered by the personal cost, the loss of freedom that a conventional marriage exacts. And we see this in the way he sees the world. We see that his perception of his own society and of the people around him and of the built environment around him change as he is less and less at peace with himself and the way his life has moved. And the same critic goes on to say, to an extent, Newland's division suggests Wharton's own. She became a successful writer, a literary professional, and a woman of letters. But as her biographers R.W.B. Lewis and Hermione Lee have established, for decades she was trapped in a bad marriage that left her sexually and emotionally unfulfilled. She blamed the coercive force of New York social convention for imprisoning her in a misguided union, even as she valued the decorum, restraint, and dignity that New York at its best had represented for her. Sharing her main character's disappointment, Wharton offers a compelling exploration of his troubled, evasive consciousness. And he goes on to write, an intense awareness of the point of view, the detailed articulation of the processes of consciousness. This is Archer looking out on the world. Visions of desire and aspiration, falling victim to temptation from the outside and to subtle self-deception and self-delusion from within. These are elements identified with the fiction of Henry James and also with that of Edith Wharton. To say that Wharton has a Jamesian aspect is not to identify her entirely with James, as though there were no real distinction to be made between them. In her work, Wharton is not simply doing what James does very well. She is doing what she herself has set out to do. And this is above all true of The Age of Innocence, Wharton's most subtle and intricate novel. Well, I want to add to this that it's also effective as a function of figurative language, in particular the ways in which architecture and interior design are configured. So here, imagery and metaphor are fused with point of view. So, for example, the facade of a building is actually a metaphor for the barrier between private and public. Description, that other so-called constituent ingredient of the novel, and especially the exterior and interior of buildings, is inseparable from both character and narrative technique. The Gordian knot of fiction remains firmly tied. And I think some further biographical details about Wharton's life may substantiate my emphasis on the importance of the built environment in her fiction. Firstly, there seems to have been something she was aware of even as a child. And in her autobiography, A Backward Glance, she gives a picture of her literary beginnings, along with a picture of her early life. Like most literary biographers, they're all portraits of the artist as a young man, to use Joyce's title. The first novel, written when she was 11, which of course was never published, began apparently, and I quote, "Oh, how do you do, Mrs. Brown?" said Mrs. Tompkins. "If only I'd known you were going to call, I should have tidied up the drawing room." The little girl showed her first novel, the opening of her first novel, to her mother, whose icy comment was, "Drawing rooms are always tidy." Now, this vignette tells of people and places, people of a certain class, living in a certain kind of community, and their social space, that is the drawing room, where visitors would be received. The drawing room was then a kind of window onto the life of the household, and it was important in this case that it be tidy. And tidy would symbolize order, cleanliness, even sexual propriety perhaps, the smooth running of the household, which would be one of a hierarchy of people from the lady and gentleman of the house to the humblest member of the household staff. Now, Wharton's interest as an adult in interior design and architecture actually preceded her rise to fame as a novelist. Her first published book was The Decoration of Houses. And there you see on the right the front cover and on the left the frontispiece. And she co-wrote this work with Ogden Codman, Jr., who was a noted American architect who worked very much in the French Beaux-Arts style. And in their book, they argued, quote, I quote, for house decoration as a branch of architecture. And they criticised, and I quote, the indifference of the wealthy to architectural fitness. Now, this may seem something of a surprise to us, because I think we all recognise that architecture and interior design are part and parcel of each other. You don't design the exterior of a building in one way and then the interior in a completely different way, unless for a particular reason. But at this point in the 1870s, in America at least, you had an architect design your house, but you didn't have an interior designer design the interior. You filled it with things that you thought were the appropriate sorts of things to fill it with. And they claimed that there was no logic in this treatment of the interior and exterior as separate and distinct, but that it should be a single aesthetic project. And it should be guided by principles of simplicity rather than ornament. They were very critical of Victorian-style interior decoration, which was obviously inspired to some degree by the English tradition. Rooms hung with very heavy window curtains, large, overstuffed, upholstered furniture. They argued that rooms like these emphasise fabric and upholstery at the expense of the proper planning of space and thought-out architectural design. And the consequence was that rooms designed along these lines were actually uncomfortable to be in and therefore little used. They were a statement for visitors rather than a space to be lived in and enjoyed. So Wharton and Codman advocated the creation of houses with rooms decorated with strong wall and ceiling treatments to draw the eye up and out so as to create a sense of space and emphasize volume, and that these should be complemented by appropriate furniture. Things should be simple, classical, and there should be the classical principles of symmetry and proportion and balance. And the decoration of houses is actually considered a very seminal work, and its success led to the emergence in New York and then elsewhere of professional interior designers who worked alongside architects. Now, in 1902, and this is long before Wharton was known as a writer, she had the opportunity to put her ideas into practice. She bought property in Lenox, Massachusetts, 113 acres, and with the help of architects and engineers, she built the Mount. And there it is. A Georgian mansion with a great cascade of beautiful gardens, and it was the ideal environment for her as designer, gardener, hostess, and of course, writer. And just as an aside, I'd like you to consider the Mount alongside Nohant, which was Georges Sand's manor house that I showed in my lecture on Georges Sand. Wharton was a great admirer of Georges Sand. She'd visited Nohant with her parents as a child, and she returned with Henry James, in fact, on another pilgrimage. But this is Nohant, and you'll see that there are some particular characteristics. There are shuttered windows, there are these coins, a broken facade, so that's one plane, and then either side these protrude. There are windows in the roof, and there's a mixture of arched and horizontal treatment of doors and windows. These are arched here. And if we go back to the Mount, you'll see similarly, it's slightly blurred, I'm afraid, but there are coins down those edges. It's a broken facade in 3 sections. There are windows in the roof, there are shutters, and there's a mixture of arched and horizontal windows. So I don't know this to be the case, but it seems to me very likely that when Wharton was considering the design for the mount, she had Noel very much in mind. Now, the building work on the mount proceeded quickly, remarkably quickly, if we think about how long buildings take to build now. Within a year, Wharton reported, likening herself to a book, and I quote, "Lennox has had its usual tonic effect on me, and I feel like a new edition, revised and corrected in the very best type. It's great fun to be here, as everything is pushing up new shoots, not only cabbages and strawberries, but electric lights and plumbing. I really think we shall be installed after a fashion by September the 1st. And as moving in day came nearer, she thanked her publisher, Scribner's at the time, for who she was writing short stories, for a timely royalty payment. She was obviously struggling to pay. Things went over budget, as they always do. And in a letter to Scribner, she writes, "Many thanks for the cheque for $2,191.81, which even to the 81 cents is welcome to an author in the last throes of house building." And in a letter to a friend some weeks later, she exclaimed, "Finalmente, we've been in the new house for 10 days and have enjoyed every minute of it." But most telling, I think, is a letter she wrote to Morton Fullerton, which described just how much of herself she felt she'd invested in the Mount project. And she wrote, "I'm amazed at the success of my efforts. Decidedly, I'm a better landscape gardener than novelist. And this place, every line of which is my own, far surpasses the House of Mirth." And Henry James, I think, recognised this and wrote, and I quote, "No one fully knows our Edith who hasn't seen her in the act of creating a habitation for herself." So just as character and setting are fused in her novels, so clearly her friends saw her personality intimately bound up with the Mount. And I think however good a novelist we think she is, I do think we have to admire her as a landscape designer. I think the Mount and its gardens, which you can still visit in Lenox, Massachusetts, over 100 acres of them, are really very, very beautiful. Now, the House of Mirth, which she thinks is far surpassed by her work as architect, interior designer, and landscape architect, whatever Wharton's protestations, is a very wonderful novel, and one in which character and setting are already to some degree fused. At the beginning, we're introduced to Lawrence Selden, the bachelor lawyer, who lives in a comfortable apartment, complete with, and I quote, "shabby leather chairs," unquote, "faded oriental carpets, and a pleasant balcony. This is his safe haven to which he retreats and from whose balcony he witnesses the lives of others." In sharp contrast, at the end of the novel, we see Lily Bart, the unmarried heroine of the novel, in her boarding house, quote, "where there was no other token of her personality about the room unless it showed itself in the scrupulous neatness." That's the end of the quotation. Selden has money, Lily has none. Selden is a man and Lily a woman. Selden has made a home for himself, one with the trappings of a gentleman's club. The only aspect of her personality that Lily can project onto her surroundings is her tidiness, a sign of her adherence to certain principles which Wharton was taught about by her mother at the age of 11 when she wrote her first novel. Wharton's use of architecture and interior design is more developed in the Age of Innocence, as Cynthia G. Falk has demonstrated, and to whom I'm indebted in the following discussion. And this is her article, The Intolerable Ugliness of New York. But I'd like to take further her treatment of architecture in the novel and underline the inextricable relationship between character, social ritual, and setting. These are brilliantly conflated. The rebellious Ellen's grandmother, Mrs. Manson Mingott, so Ellen, of course, is the woman who has left and married the Count and returned, and she has a wonderful grandmother called Catherine Mingott. And I quote, so Mrs. Manson Mingott, and I quote, put the crowning touch to her audacities by building a large house of cream-coloured stone in an inaccessible wilderness near the Central Park. And of course, those of you who know New York today would not consider Central Park to be in a wilderness. It was clearly in the 1870s. Now, her audacity in doing this would have been obvious to contemporary readers of Wharton's novel who remembered New York in the 1870s. As far as they were concerned, the wealthy lived in brownstone buildings, not brash, my word, cream-coloured stone. And early on in the novel we read, quote, brown sandstone seemed as much the only wear as a frock coat in the afternoon. And a little later, again of brownstone, quote, its hue coated New York like a cold chocolate sauce. And this is thrown into relief by Catherine Mingott wanting a house of cream-coloured stone. So they're obviously in areas of the city and out areas, like the wilderness near the Central Park. And all this is what Wharton herself calls in the novel, and I quote, the hieroglyphic world where the real thing was never said or done or even thought, but only represented by a set of arbitrary signs. I think that's a wonderful quotation, so I'll just repeat. The hieroglyphic world, a world of signs, where the real thing was never said or done or even thought, but only represented by a set of arbitrary signs. Wharton likewise doesn't tell us that Catherine Mingott is an iconoclast, that Catherine Mingott wants to do things differently. This all emerges as a function of her relationship, in this case, with architecture, her desire to build in a part of the city that is deemed to be beyond the pale, and B, with cream-coloured stone rather than brownstone. In The Age of Innocence, we're told that fashionable New York society in the 1870s could be represented as a pyramid with 3 tiers. At the top were a small number of families that could, quote, claim an aristocratic origin in the real sense of the word, unquote. So those who came from aristocratic families in Europe. In the middle was a group of families descended from, and I quote, respectable English or Dutch merchants. And at the bottom, wealthy but inconspicuous people who had often been, quote, raised above their level by marriage with one of the ruling clans. That's the end of the quotation. So rather than explicitly categorising the characters of the novels in terms of class, characters are associated with architecture and interior design. The most aristocratic family of the novel, the Van der Ludens, own, I quote, a large solemn house, unquote. From Archer's point of view, its, quote, high-ceilinged, white-wall drawing room was so complete an image of its owners, suggesting that the family was cold and distant. The Van der Ludens, it turns out, are rarely in New York, and more often at one of their country estates. You can't get more distant than that. The novel's protagonist, Newland Archer, belongs to the middle stratum, and his family is insufficiently wealthy to own proper estates. Summers are spent out of town, but in the autumn they return to New York and to a clearly circumscribed area of the city around Lower Fifth Avenue between Washington Square and 40th Street. Every year, we read, on the 15th of October, Fifth Avenue opened its shutters, unrolled its carpets, and hung up its triple layer of window curtains. And of course, we know that these thick, heavy curtains were not to Wharton's liking, but symbolised introspection and suffocation. So living outside the inn areas, as Ellen and her mother Mingott choose to do, is obviously considered not the thing. And Ellen remarks to Archer at one point, and I quote, I've never been in a city where there seems to be such a feeling against living in des quartiers excentriques. And the quartiers excentriques are not eccentric quarters, but the outlying areas, those beyond the centre. And she herself has shunned convention and has rented a house from her vagabond aunt Medora, quote, far down West 23rd Street, unquote. And in the summer, instead of vacationing in Newport, Rhode Island, which was the done thing, she chose to stay in Portsmouth, Rhode Island. Catherine Mingott remarks, that's her grandmother, remarks to Archer, quote, "When I built this house, you'd have thought I was moving to California. Nobody ever had built above 40th Street. No, says I, nor above the Buttery either, before Christopher Columbus discovered America. No, not one of them wants to be different. They're as scared of it as the smallpox." But there's an element of this architectural hieroglyphic that goes beyond matters of taste and convention. A contrast is clearly established between architecture that's American and therefore inward-looking, and architecture that draws on European traditions and is therefore outward-looking. When Archer, deeply in love with Ellen, visits her rented house, we hear his reactions. This is his point of view. The atmosphere of the room was so different from any he had ever breathed that self-consciousness vanished in the sense of adventure. He'd been in drawing rooms hung with red damask, with pictures of the Italian school. What struck him was the way in which Medora Manson's shabby hired house had, by a turn of the hand and the skillful use of a few properties, been turned into something intimate, foreign, subtly suggestive of old romantic scenes and sentiments. And this contrasts with his mother and sister, whose real interest is in collecting American revolutionary glazed ware, and the notion that it's both American and glazed ware, in other words, cold and hard, throws Ellen's interior very much into relief. And so this opposition is opened up between characters who are very much wedded to the American tradition and its architectural styles and its artifacts, and those who are drawn to things European. And women in these two groups are further opposed. Those committed to all things American don't want freedom, it emerges. They protect themselves from anything unusual or unpleasant, and they only ever express the views of their husbands, brothers, or fathers. They never speak for themselves. When they enter marriage, these are characterized, and I quote, as dull associations of material and social interests held together by ignorance. Those who want to adopt European styles, on the other hand, are shown to be independent and keen to travel. And Catherine Mingott and her granddaughter Ellen Lenska are, of course, the prime examples. Now, Wharton was writing The Age of Innocence at the very end of the First World War. She'd been resident in France throughout the war, and she'd seen much of the destruction that war had brought. She wrote a number of articles for Scribner's magazine which described those horrors, and by implication, she advocated greater American involvement in Europe. And as Cynthia Falk has convincingly argued, and I quote, "The Age of Innocence continued in the spirit of Wharton's wartime work. In the years immediately following the surrender of the Central Powers, by that she means Germany, Austria-Hungary, the role of the increasingly powerful United States would play in rehabilitating war-torn Europe remained unclear. US President Woodrow Wilson opposed subjecting Germany to financial reparations that would help other European nations, particularly France and England," she's an American, she means France and Great Britain, "recover from the destruction they had suffered during the war. Leaders in the US were equally resistant to the creation of a League of Nations, which might require their nation once again to use military force to aid European allies. Wharton's concern was to encourage Americans to look beyond insular patriotic tendencies that might lead to isolationism. She urged her readers to look to France with both compassion and an eye towards their own national betterment." So writing The Age of Innocence was not the nostalgic looking back that she herself claimed. It was an opportunity to reassess the culture in which she'd largely grown up and to question the artistic and social conventions which had shaped her, but which she was able critically to reassess as a woman, as an artist. And it's this distance which she established early on, which prevented her from being left behind, as many of her generation felt they had been. Remember the critic talking about it stolidly solidifying. So, by way of conclusion, my contention is that the novel and Wharton's novels generally, The Age of Innocence and Wharton's novels generally, should be read less as acutely observed social satires, but rather as highly charged psychological novels. And this is because of Wharton's innovations as a novelist and her reinvention of the idea of fictional character as inseparable from the people and objects that surround it. And the objects that come to be most highly charged and significant are those of the built environment. This is brilliantly expressed, I think, when we hear from Archer's point of view of his mother's astute insights into New York social hierarchies. No one is better than Mrs. Archer at seeing these fine nuances of social distinction. And I quote, "She was able to trace each new crack in its surface and all the strange weeds pushing up between the ordered rows of social vegetables." The crack in the surface suggests a crack in a built facade, and the weeds pushing up between the ordered rows of social vegetables are, of course, the people. But I'd like to finish by proposing a distinction between the built environment that characters inhabit and the idea of archaeological remains. So architecture and the built environment as being of the moment and of modern history, and archaeological remains being ancient. This, I think, is one of the most brilliant descriptions in The Age of Innocence, and it's of the wonderful Catherine Mingott, Ellen's grandmother, who is the independent woman who builds in the wilds and builds in cream-coloured stone rather than brownstone chocolate sauce. And this is the quotation describing her. "The immense accretion of flesh that had descended on her in middle life, like a flood of lava on a doomed city, had changed her into something as vast and august as a natural phenomenon. She had accepted this submergence as philosophically as all her other trials, and now, in extreme old age, was rewarded by presenting to her mirror an almost unwrinkled expanse of firm pink and white flesh, in the centre of which the traces of a small face survived, as if waiting excavation. Around and below, wave after wave of black silk surged away over the edges of a capacious armchair, with two tiny hands poised like gulls on the surface of the billows." Now, here she is in the film. And frankly, one doesn't get the same fun out of looking at Mrs. Mingott that one gets out of reading Wharton describing her as this archaeological piece. Now, why does she describe her appealing to an archaeological imagery as opposed to an architectural imagery? Well, of course, the description's full of irony. Mrs. Mingott is overweight, but she accepts her figure philosophically. And I think the figurative language of archaeology is suggestive of her capacity to outlive her peers. There's a wonderful sense of freedom in the appeal to sea imagery, the black silk surging wave after wave, and her hands like gulls poised, ready, presumably, to take flight, as Wharton herself had known to do when she moved permanently to Europe in 1912. Thank you.